I've always loved camping. The allure of the woods, the fresh scent of pine, the crackling of the campfire. It was my escape from the concrete jungle. So when my friends bailed on our annual trip to the Appalachian Mountains, I decided to go solo. After all, I'd been to these mountains a dozen times before and knew the trails like the back of my hand. I arrived at the base of the mountains early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The parking lot was empty, as expected for a weekday. I loaded my backpack, checked my gear, and started the hike up to my favorite spot, an isolated clearing with a small, serene lake. It was a good 3-hour trek, but the solitude and beauty of the place made it worth every step. The hike was uneventful, just the way I liked it. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional squirrel darted across the trail. By noon, I reached the clearing and set up my camp. The lake shimmered under the midday sun, and I took a moment to soak in the tranquility. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and by late afternoon, I was sitting by a roaring fire, roasting a hot dog and enjoying the simplicity of it all. As dusk settled, a chill crept into the air. I wrapped myself in a blanket, gazing at the stars that began to dot the night sky. It was perfect until I heard it, a distant, almost imperceptible scream. It was faint, but it was there. At first, I thought it was an animal. Mountain lions were known to roam these parts, and their calls could sound eerily human. I brushed it off and continued enjoying my evening. The scream came again, this time closer. It was a high-pitched, almost childlike wail that sent a shiver down my spine. I stood up, straining my ears to locate the source. The forest around me was dark, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows. My mind raced through the possibilities. An injured hiker, perhaps. But who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere? "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and uncertain. "Is anyone there?" Silence. The kind of silence that makes you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks. But a part of me, a primal part buried deep inside, knew something was off. I tried to shake off the unease and retreated to my tent, zipping it up tightly. I kept my flashlight and a hunting knife close, just in case. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the crackling of the dying fire. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. A loud snap jolted me awake. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The fire was down to embers, casting a dim, orange glow. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. There, at the edge of the clearing, something moved. A shadow, tall and thin, almost blending with the trees. I blinked, trying to focus. The figure was gone. I swept the flashlight back and forth, but there was nothing, just darkness and the eerie silence. I retreated into my tent, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? I lay back down, clutching the knife, my ears straining for any sound. The scream came again, this time right outside my tent. It was a guttural, bone-chilling wail that made my blood run cold. I froze, too terrified to move. The tent rustled, as if something, or someone, was brushing against it. My breathing was shallow, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The night was silent once more. I waited, muscles tense, every nerve on edge. Minutes felt like hours, but nothing happened. Slowly, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I packed up my camp with trembling hands. I didn't care about breakfast or the peaceful scenery. I just wanted to get out of there. I hiked back down the trail, constantly looking over my shoulder, every rustle of leaves making me jump. When I finally reached my car, I tossed my gear in the back and sped away, not stopping until I was miles from the mountain. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? It sounded like a bad horror movie plot, but I knew what I experienced was real. Too real. Months later, I stumbled upon a local legend while researching the area. They called it the Silent Screamer, a tall, shadowy figure that roamed the Appalachian Mountains. Its screams driving people mad or worse, leading them to their doom. Skeptics dismissed it as folklore, but I knew better. I haven't been back to those mountains since. My love for camping is tarnished by that night. The memory of the Silent Screamer, forever etched in my mind. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that scream, distant but unmistakable. A haunting reminder of the terror that lurks just beyond the campfire's glow. I've always had a fascination with urban legends. Growing up in a small town in Maine, tales of ghostly apparitions and mysterious creatures were part of our local lore, but none of those stories compared to what I experienced last fall in the dense woods behind my childhood home. It was late October, just before Halloween, when the incident happened. My friends and I were planning a small gathering at my place, a farewell party of sorts. Before we all went off to different colleges, we decided to make it memorable by camping out in the woods, where we used to play as kids. Little did we know we were in for a night we'd never forget. The day started like any other crisp autumn morning. We gathered supplies, set up tents, and by late afternoon, we had a cozy little campsite. The fire pit was ready, marshmallows and hot dogs were skewered, and stories of old adventures filled the air as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. I brushed it off as nostalgia mixed with a bit of pre-college anxiety. The first sign that something was wrong came just after dusk. We were sitting around the campfire, laughing and joking, when we heard a rustling noise from the underbrush. It wasn't uncommon to hear animals at night, but this sounded different, deliberate, almost cautious. Probably just a deer, Mark said, poking the fire with a stick. We all nodded, trying to convince ourselves he was right, but deep down, we knew something was off. The rustling stopped, and we resumed our conversation, albeit with a bit more tension. An hour later, the real terror began. We were in the middle of telling ghost stories when a low, guttural growl echoed through the woods. It was unlike any animal sound I had ever heard, deep, menacing, and far too close for comfort. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We all turned our heads toward the sound, straining our ears. The growl came again, this time closer, sending chills down my spine. It was followed by a series of soft, deliberate footsteps, the kind that make you think someone, or something, is stalking you. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the perimeter of our campsite. The beams of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. But then, at the edge of the clearing, we saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the light, staring back at us from the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The eyes were unnaturally large and too high off the ground to be any ordinary animal. We stood there, paralyzed by fear, as the creature stepped forward into the dim light of our campfire. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and covered in dark, matted fur. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in sharp, claw-like hands. The most disturbing part was its face, or lack thereof. Where a face should have been, there was just a blank, featureless expanse, except for those glowing eyes. "Run!" I shouted, breaking the spell of terror that held us in place. We bolted in different directions, the sound of crashing branches and heavy footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting to safety. I ran blindly through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon an old hunting cabin we used to explore as kids. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. The cabin was musty and filled with cobwebs, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the nightmare outside. I huddled in a corner, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Minutes passed like hours, and the only sounds were my own labored breathing and the distant calls of night birds. Just when I started to believe I was safe, the door creaked open slowly. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by the moonlight. For a moment, I thought it was one of my friends, but then I saw the eyes, those glowing, predatory eyes. The creature entered the cabin, its movements slow and deliberate, almost as if it were savoring the hunt. I had nowhere to go. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The creature sniffed the air, its head swiveling from side to side. It was searching for me. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but every exit seemed blocked. Just when I thought it was over, a loud crash echoed from outside. The creature snapped its head towards the noise and bounded out of the cabin, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. I didn't wait to see what caused the distraction. I bolted from the cabin and ran back towards the campsite. By some miracle, I found my friends huddled together near the fire, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. We didn't speak. We just grabbed our things and made a beeline for home, not stopping until we were safely inside my house. We never spoke of that night again. The woods behind my house, once a place of childhood wonder, became a forbidden zone. We heard stories from other townsfolk, rumors of a creature lurking in the forest, preying on those who ventured too far from the safety of their homes. They called it the Lurker, a name that sent shivers down my spine every time I heard it. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. Was it a cryptid, a ghost, or some twisted figment of our imagination? All I know is that it was real, and it was terrifying. And every time I hear a rustling in the woods, or see a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness, I'm reminded of the night we encountered the Lurker, and how close we came to becoming its prey. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest. My friends and I had decided to spend a weekend camping in the Appalachian Mountains, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. We were all seasoned campers, but something about this trip felt different, more ominous. Maybe it was the isolation or the eerie stillness that hung in the air. Nevertheless, we shrugged off our unease and focused on setting up our campsite. By the time we had our tents pitched and a fire crackling, darkness had settled in. We gathered around the fire, its flickering flames casting an orange glow on our faces. We told ghost stories, laughed, and enjoyed the warmth of the fire. The night was unusually quiet, the typical sounds of nocturnal wildlife conspicuously absent. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. As the night wore on, we decided to call it a night. One by one, we retreated to our tents. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the fabric rustling softly in the silence. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had been nagging at me all evening. Sleep came slowly, a restless, uneasy slumber. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure what had roused me, but the silence was deafening. I glanced at my watch. It was just past 2 a.m. I lay still, straining to hear any sound. Then I heard it, a faint, distant rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. It was too rhythmic to be the wind, and too deliberate to be a small animal. My curiosity got the better of me. I quietly unzipped my tent and peered outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint light around our campsite. I saw nothing unusual, but the rustling continued, growing louder and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, the cold night air biting at my skin. I aimed the beam of light towards the source of the noise, sweeping it across the trees. The rustling stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I felt a chill run down my spine, just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination. I saw something that made my blood run cold. Between the trees, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. The flashlight's beam illuminated its eyes, which glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. It had no discernible features, just a shadowy form that seemed to blend into the forest. I froze, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The figure stood still for a moment, then began to move towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backwards, almost dropping the flashlight. I turned and ran towards the nearest tent, shouting to wake my friends. "Get up! There's something out here." My shouts roused them, and they emerged from their tents, bleary-eyed and confused. I pointed towards the trees, my hand shaking. "There. Do you see it?" They turned their flashlights in the direction I was pointing, but the figure was gone. The forest was silent once more, as if nothing had happened. My friends looked at me with a mix of concern and skepticism. "Are you sure you saw something?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "I know what I saw," I insisted, my voice trembling. It wasn't human." We gathered around the dying fire, our flashlights casting jittery beams of light in the darkness. No one suggested going back to sleep. Instead, we sat in uneasy silence, listening for any sound that might indicate the figure's return. Hours passed, and the tension slowly eased as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. With daylight came a renewed sense of safety. We discussed what had happened, trying to rationalize the encounter. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. We decided to pack up and leave, cutting our trip short. As we broke camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig, the decision to hike through the pine barrens in New Jersey, was a spontaneous one, prompted by a rare weekend off from work. I had always been drawn to the legends of the area, particularly the tales of the Jersey Devil. Growing up, I had heard countless stories about this cryptid, half-man, half-beast, with leathery wings and glowing red eyes. While I had always been skeptical, part of me hoped to catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. It was early October, and the leaves had just begun to turn, painting the forest in hues of orange and gold. I arrived at the trailhead in the late morning, armed with a backpack filled with essentials and a sense of excitement. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pallor over the landscape, but I paid it little mind. I set off along the path, my footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. The hike was serene, the air filled with the earthy scent of decaying foliage. I encountered a few other hikers along the way, exchanging pleasantries, but mostly keeping to myself. By mid-afternoon, I had ventured deeper into the woods, far from the more frequented trails. The forest around me grew denser, the trees towering and ancient. As I walked, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. The birds had stopped singing, and the forest seemed to grow darker, despite the time of day. An uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it aside, attributing it to my imagination. I continued on, determined to explore as much as I could before nightfall. About an hour later, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its wooden structure barely holding together. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it cautiously. The door hung ajar, creaking on its hinges as a gust of wind blew through the clearing. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The cabin was empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture and an old, rusted stove. I explored for a few minutes, my flashlight cutting through the dim interior. As I was about to leave, I noticed something odd. A set of claw marks gouged deep into one of the wooden beams. They were long and deep, too large to have been made by any animal I knew of. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided it was time to head back. The sun was setting, and I didn't want to be caught in the forest after dark. I exited the cabin and began retracing my steps. The forest seemed even darker now, the shadows lengthening and merging into one another. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, a low guttural growl that seemed to echo through the trees. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat, and turned slowly in the direction of the sound. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It stood on two legs, its body covered in dark, matted fur. Leathery wings jutted from its back, and its eyes glowed an eerie red in the dim light. The Jersey Devil. It had to be. For a moment, we stood frozen, staring at each other. Then it let out a blood-curdling screech and charged. Panic overtook me, and I turned and ran as fast as I could, my mind racing with terror. I could hear its heavy footsteps behind me, the sound of its wings flapping. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get to my car, to safety. The path seemed endless, my legs burning with exertion. The screeching grew louder, closer. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst out of the forest and into the parking lot. My car was in sight, a beacon of hope. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and finally managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, I sat there, gasping for breath, expecting the creature to tear the car apart. But the parking lot was empty. The forest stood silent, as if nothing had happened. I started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I was miles away that I began to calm down. The encounter felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I knew what I had seen, but who would believe me? The Jersey Devil was just a legend, a story told to frighten children. Yet I had seen it with my own eyes, heard it screech, felt its presence. That night, I vowed never to return to the Pine Barrens. Some legends, I realized, are best left alone. I had always considered myself a rational person, a skeptic even. My friends teased me about my disbelief in the supernatural, calling me the ultimate debunker. It wasn't until that one harrowing night in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest that my skepticism was put to the ultimate test. It was a camping trip that I would never forget. The plan was simple: a weekend getaway to reconnect with nature, away from the humdrum of our everyday lives. My friends Dave, Sarah, and I had been talking about this trip for months. We were all avid hikers, and the idea of exploring a remote part of the forest excited us. We packed our gear, planned our route, and set off early one Friday morning. The drive took us deep into the wilderness, far from any signs of civilization. Our destination was a secluded spot near an old logging trail, a place Dave's uncle had mentioned in passing. He had warned us about the isolation, but that was precisely what we were looking for. As we set up camp, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the towering trees. The first night was uneventful. We shared stories around the campfire, roasted marshmallows, and laughed until our sides hurt. The stars above were brighter than I had ever seen, and the air was crisp and clean. We went to bed that night feeling content and peaceful, completely unaware of what lay ahead. The next day, we decided to hike deeper into the forest. Dave had a map and compass, and we trusted his navigation skills. The trail was rugged and overgrown, but we were experienced hikers and pressed on. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to grow denser and darker, the trees closing in around us. The feeling of isolation became more pronounced, and an unsettling quiet descended. Around midday, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It looked as though it had been untouched for decades, the wood weathered and moss-covered. Curious, we decided to investigate. The inside was dark and musty, filled with the remnants of someone's life. Old furniture, rusted tools, and yellowed newspapers littered the floor. There was an eerie stillness to the place that made my skin crawl. "Let's keep moving," I suggested, eager to put some distance between us and the cabin. Dave and Sarah agreed, and we resumed our hike. However, as we ventured further, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us. By late afternoon, we decided to head back to camp. The sense of unease had grown, and none of us felt like exploring any further. As we retraced our steps, the forest seemed even more oppressive than before. The shadows lengthened, and the air grew colder. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made us jumpy and paranoid. We reached our campsite just as the sun dipped below the horizon. We quickly built a fire and huddled close, the flickering flames providing a semblance of comfort. The night was unnaturally quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and our own nervous breathing. "Did you guys feel like we were being watched today?" Sarah finally voiced what we were all thinking. Dave and I exchanged uneasy glances, but nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it was weird," Dave admitted. "I've hiked these woods before, but I've never felt anything like that." We tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I knew something was off. The forest felt alive in a way that was different from the usual wilderness. It was as if the very trees were watching us. As the night wore on, exhaustion overcame us, and we retreated to our tents. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to rationalize the day's events. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, unlike any animal I had ever encountered. I sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The growl came again, closer this time. My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. I fumbled for my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Dave whispered from his tent. Sarah emerged, her face pale with fear. We stood there, flashlights scanning the forest, but saw nothing. The growl came again, a chilling sound that seemed to reverberate through the trees. Panic set in, and we gathered together, our backs to the fire, trying to see in every direction at once. "Let's get back in the tents," I suggested, though I knew it was a futile attempt at safety. We retreated, but sleep was impossible. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Hours passed in tense silence, until finally, exhaustion claimed us. When we awoke, the sun was rising, and the oppressive feeling had lifted slightly. We decided to cut our trip short and leave immediately. Packing up camp was done in record time. None of us spoke much, the fear still fresh in our minds. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. Finally, we reached the car and piled in, eager to put the forest behind us. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. My breath caught in my throat, and I sped up, not daring to look back again. We didn't speak of the encounter much after that. It was as if acknowledging it would make it real. But the experience stayed with me, a haunting reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. I had always been a skeptic, but that weekend in the forest changed me. Some things are better left unexplored, and some places are better left undisturbed.